Welcome back to Political Spirits. I'm your host, Franklin Rye. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated, at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? Today we have a great guest on the phone. I'm honored to introduce Thurston Clarke. He's an author, historian, and journalist with 13 acclaimed books to his name, including 3 that have been officially designated by the New York Times as notable books. He's the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship. His work, Pearl Harbor Ghosts, was the basis of a CBS documentary, and his biography of Raoul Wallenberg, who saved tens of thousands of Jews in Nazi-occupied Hungary, became an award-winning NBC miniseries. Today, we're going to focus on his latest work entitled Honorable Exit, How a Few Brave Americans Risked All to Save Our Vietnamese Allies at the End of the War. Thurston, thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
The first thing I want to say is that it isn't always apparent from the get-go that a book is a great book. But I have to tell you that it took me exactly 4 paragraphs to realize that Honorable Exit is extremely well written, extremely well researched, and that I was going to be emotionally affected by this read. I'm not embarrassed to say that I was only 4 paragraphs into the prologue before I started tearing up. It's a powerful work.
Thank you. I worked hard on that prologue. I went through a number of iterations, and I think I finally got it right.
Yeah, I absolutely agree on that. So my first question, it's a little bit of a long one, but let's take a minute here. So what you've accomplished with Honorable Exit is to find honor in the midst of what many would say was dishonor. One of your prior works I'd mention includes a biography of Raoul Wallenberg, who, like Oskar Schindler, was involved in saving huge numbers of Jews in World War II. In Honorable Exit, you reveal the heroic efforts of many Americans to save thousands of South Vietnamese allies as North Vietnamese forces were taking over the country in 1975. Did you consciously set out to uncover those heroic efforts, to examine individual heroism as you did with Raoul Wallenberg, to essentially reveal more Oskar Schindlers? Or were you engaging in a more open-ended research effort that happened to uncover this widespread bravery?
I would say it was more of an open-ended research effort. I started by knowing that 130,000 South Vietnamese had gotten out in 6 weeks, had gotten out of their country, and had ended up in the United States and been given citizenship. So I started wondering. I wanted to find out how this had happened. Was it strictly a government program? I mean, was it our military and State Department that decided to do this? And I discovered that it was not until the very end, until the last week, really, that the government officially began to facilitate the exodus of these people. And that before that, it was the work of a number of American Wallenbergs and Schindlers in South Vietnam who took it on themselves to defy their government, to go against what was then the policy and smuggle these people out or look the other way. The people who did this were diplomats, they were military people. They included actually the top American military man, General Homer Smith, in South Vietnam, who was the defense attaché at the time. So it was more these stories kept piling up one after another that I realized there had been a kind of large uncoordinated mutiny on the part of these Americans against their government, and that finally the government had been forced by their actions to play catch-up and bring these people to the United States. There were some of the Vietnamese who were rescued later, years later and decades later, compared their American rescuers to Wallenberg and Schindler. And I mentioned some of these in the prologue that you mentioned, particularly I'm talking about Jackie Bong, who was the widow of a South Vietnamese politician who was assassinated by the Viet Cong. And she later wrote a memoir comparing the Americans who spirited her out of Saigon to the righteous Gentiles of the Holocaust. And so she described how she had gotten out involving an American pretending to be her husband so that they could get through the gate at Tan Son Nhut Airport. That was the problem that a lot of Vietnamese had to get into the airport, to get into the airfield where they could be evacuated. They had to have an exit permit and a passport, which were very hard to get without waiting a long time and paying a lot of bribes. Mm-hmm. And so she was smuggled through with one American pretending to be her husband, a military officer, and afterwards, she wrote in her book, I was being shipped out clandestinely with the help of Americans. It reminded me of the stories of Jews being helped to flee Europe during World War II. And also in that prologue, I mentioned the teenager, Lin Duvo, who escaped on the last day, and he credited his escape to the Major General Homer Smith, who was the defense attaché I mentioned earlier. And in fact, felt so strongly about that he even, decades later, attended Smith's funeral when he died in San Antonio, traveling there on Greyhound buses from California.
Yeah, it was very inspirational. And in that specific part of the book, too, I was moved by the reference to parents who were putting their giving their children to the American soldiers to get them out, and they would leave notes on the kids to describe, my son wants to be a doctor, that sort of thing.
Yeah, my daughter is very musical. And of course, the other story in the book is the American acting consul in Da Nang, Terry Tull, who was a Foreign Service officer and one of the few female Foreign Service officers at the time in the State Department and in Vietnam, and was an expert, spoke fluent Vietnamese. And she was in Da Nang just before it was about to fall, and the general who was in charge of the military district up there, he asked her if she would adopt his children and take them out of the country. And she agreed to do it, and she did bring them out. As it turned out, their parents did get out later, but she took his children with her. Thought she would have them for the rest of their lives.
Amazing stories, and some of them with the parents that had to make a sort of a Sophie's choice. The one parent who had to choose between, she said she couldn't give up her toddler, and her oldest son was too close to draft age, so she had the three ones in the middle go.
Right. Yeah, those were the three that Terry Tull agreed to adopt. So that happened all the time. And at the end, I talk about another Vietnamese woman who was the senior female official in the South Vietnamese government at the time. And she took her daughters with her, and her teenage sons happened to be on the other side of town with her husband. And they never got out, and she didn't see them for 20 years.
Wow. As I read this book, it struck me that it's made to be a movie or a mini series. I mean, it would make a wonderful addition to the big screen or a mini series format in a television on television.
Yeah, it's actually the story has been, my book has been optioned by a production company in Hollywood, Red Wagon, and with them and with Warner Brothers. And
great.
A script has been written. It's just been finished, and so we'll see what happens with that. But
all right. Well, hopefully
it's pretty far along right now in the development phase.
So, with all these inspirational stories, do you have a favorite one that is perhaps the most inspirational, or just strikes you separate from the others for some other reason?
There are a bunch. Ones that happen at different phases in the story, because it's a 6-week period when things are collapsing there.
Yeah.
There's one that, I like to say that these people were putting their lives on the line, which they were, particularly in the last couple of days. But there was one of a man, Walter Martindale, who was a American official in the central part of the country, in the Central Highlands, and it fell to the communists in the end of March. And he organized a caravan of his Vietnamese employees and their family members and led them out away from an area that was about to fall to the communists into the coast. And he was heading for a Nha Trang, which was a place, a coastal town that hadn't yet been taken over. And along the way, his caravan was stopped by South Vietnamese soldiers who they weren't really deserters. Their units had just collapsed, and they were all making on their own, making for safety. Walter had a caravan of about 3 or 4 trucks with his refugees in them. And he had to have a shootout with one of 3 or 4 of the South Vietnamese soldiers who stopped him in the middle of the road and were starting to pull his people out of the trucks so they could use the trucks to take themselves to the coast. And one of them leveled their gun and fired at him. He shot back, and they scattered. So here was a case where he was really, risking his own life. The final day saw him on the roof of a apartment building in downtown Saigon helping people get into one of the helicopters, the Air American helicopters that were landing there, and had to be persuaded, almost pulled into the helicopter to save himself. But there were a lot of stories like that. I think one of my other heroes is Foreign Service officer Ken Moorfield, who was in charge of the processing center at Tan Son Nhut Airport in the final 10 days. And he was essentially looking the other way to this ruse that people used to get people out, whereby you could claim that someone was American. Any American could claim that a list of people on an affidavit were members of his family, his adopted family, and some people were claiming to have adopted 10 or 15 South Vietnamese. And Moorfield just looked the other way, and he had one incident that didn't haunt him because he solved it, where he had a nun, I believe it was an Irish nun, who showed up with about 60 orphans who she wanted to get out at the same time, and also employees of the orphanage. And Moorfield said, I just can't put them all, at once, or the South Vietnamese officials here are going to smell something and they're going to shut us down. So he said, so why don't you come back and divide yourselves into smaller family groups and bring some of your other employees and have them claim that they've adopted these children, and then I'll get them out in groups, which is what he did.
Now, were most of them going to Clarke Air Base in the Philippines?
At first, yes, they were going to Clarke Air Base. In the end, they ended up also in Guam. And, of course, the people who got out by sea went at first to the Philippines.
Now, that had some sort of a special connection to me because I, as a child, I lived for a couple of years on Clarke. In the late 60s, my father was assigned there, and he would go back and forth to Vietnam, 6 months in Vietnam, 6 months in the Philippines. So, I have fond childhood memories of Clarke, and there was a fair amount of pushback, was there, from the Philippine bureaucrats to the
from the Marcos. Well, from the Marcos regime, because all of these people were, when the airlift began, when the kind of clandestine airlift began, the U.S. Air Force transport planes that were bringing supplies to the South Vietnamese government and army and would normally be coming back empty, they would come back with 10, 15, 20, 100 South Vietnamese refugees
Yeah.
who didn't have visas or papers for the Philippines or for the United States. And the Marcos regime complained to the U.S. ambassador, then who then in turn complained to the State Department, that then turned around and said to Graham Martin, who was the U.S. ambassador, what's happening? Why are we suddenly getting all these Vietnamese? But basically, Martin was at the embassy. Ton Sanut was 20 minutes away, and a lot of this was happening without him knowing about it. He learned about it later, but a lot of this, the early smuggling, was going on without his knowledge, but with the knowledge of the General Homer Smith.
So Graham Martin, my view of him changed a bit during the course of the book. And if you read about him, outside the book, go to Wikipedia or wherever, you see a more critical treatment. Did your opinion of him change as you researched, or did you have a view going in?
Well, it wasn't so much my opinion changed, but what he did kind of changed over the course of these 6 weeks. And in the end, his fear was that if he, allowed thousands of South Vietnamese to kind of leave, that there would be a complete breakdown of the government and the armed forces. And also, he didn't believe that the communists wanted to take Saigon, which is the big problem he had. He was convinced that there wasn't really a need to evacuate these people because the North Vietnamese army was going to stop outside of Saigon and negotiate, because they didn't want they didn't want to destroy the city, and they didn't want to have the kind of publicity, the bad international publicity that would ensue of them coming in and there being heavy fighting in the city. So he thought that they were going to negotiate. And he wasn't the only one that thought this. A number of people in the State Department also believed, and in the CIA, including the CIA station chief, who believed that they weren't the communists. This was not their plan. Their plan was to have a coalition government and then eventually take over the country in the course of a couple of years. And unfortunately, this idea, this fantasy, this wishful thinking, was reinforced in a week before the end by the communications between Secretary of State Kissinger and the Russian ambassador in Washington. Got word from Moscow that was supposedly relaying stuff from Hanoi that they didn't intend to, quote, embarrass the United States, and they weren't going to violate the Paris Peace Accords, which means they weren't going to assault Saigon. Now, this was completely done as a disinformation campaign on the part of the North, hoping that it would lower the defenses and it would make the South less likely to fight back, because they'd think there wasn't going to be a final assault. And it was complete disinformation. But up until the last day, Martin and Kissinger believed it.
So I kept encountering those beliefs throughout the book, and my initial reaction is, what were they smoking? How could they possibly believe that? But I have to ask myself, is that just, hindsight's 20/20? I know what happened, so I can look at it very skeptically now. Do you have a different view? How did they become so convinced of something that seems so fundamentally illogical now?
Well, they wanted to believe it because they didn't want to believe that the 55,000 Americans and all the money spent had been a complete waste.
Yeah.
They still wanted to believe there could be Kissinger's peace with honor. They didn't want to believe that that it was going to be such a humiliating defeat for the United States. So that's what they wanted to believe. So every time they saw something that seemed to confirm that prejudice, they believed it and fastened on it. Every time they learned things or people told them things that seemed to contradict that, they didn't want to believe it. And that's why this disinformation in the final week by the Russians and the North Vietnamese was so eagerly seized upon by Kissinger, by Graham Martin, and believed. And so yes, they were certainly deluded. The idea that the communists who'd been fighting since the Second World War to try to unify the country under a communist regime were going to, when the victory was clearly within their grasp, were going to simply negotiate with the South Vietnamese politicians. Now, in hindsight, it looks ridiculous. And a lot of people thought it was ridiculous at the time.
Yeah.
But there was evidence, there was reason for these people to believe it. I have the CIA station chief, I tell this story in the book, a couple of days before the end, the head of the National Security Agency there, who was convinced that the communists were going to take over and had been telling the CIA station chief and the NSA and Martin that there was no way that the communists weren't going to march in, and they're going to march in very soon. He was told by the CIA station chief, a guy called Polgar, said, "Listen, I'll bet you a bottle of vintage champagne, your choice, that this time next year we'll both be here in the embassy."
Wow.
And of course, he made that bet, I think, 3 days before the end.
So that brings up a question that really it's somewhat outside the scope of the book, but you do touch upon the futility of the war, the futility at various points, and some of the missteps in mismanagement of the war. But I don't think you answered this direct question, which is, do you think there's any way the U.S. could have won the Vietnam War?
Not as it was fought, no. I mean, there was no. I think it was. It would have been very, very unlikely that we could win. If you look at the slow incremental increase in the combat forces at first, and also the restraints that were put on the military. I mean, the military were not really allowed. What we were fighting for was a stalemate that would bring us the kind of agreement that we had, which is the Paris Peace Accords, which of course was a terribly flawed agreement. It allowed the communists to leave 100,000 troops, North Vietnamese troops, within the borders of South Vietnam, whereas America had to remove all of its troops except for 50 uniformed personnel as part of the defense attaché's office. But it got our POWs back. So. Yeah,
I remember the portion of the book that was talking about these pockets of communist troop presence in South Vietnam that were sort of like spots on a leopard or a jaguar that were allowed. I wasn't aware of that.
Well, there were spots in the south and places even in the outside close to Saigon that were controlled by the communists. But then there was a whole swath of land in the Central Highlands along the Cambodian and Laotian borders where you had tens of thousands of North Vietnamese troops.
Wow.
And so that was foreordained. I mean, I always think the kind of turning point for our engagement happened between the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. I mean, John F. Kennedy repeatedly refused to send combat units into Vietnam, even though he was urged to do so by his advisors, including Secretary of State McNamara and others, and he refused again and again, and he wouldn't. I believe he wouldn't have done it. Johnson, who was unschooled in foreign affairs and very unsure of himself, under his watch, of course, we went from 16,000 advisors to 500,000 troops.
So one of the things you referenced, and there was an F-105 pilot that was upset that he would be sent on bombing missions, but they wouldn't allow him to bomb the surface-to-air missile sites that were nearby.
Right.
Why would the government restrict that? I couldn't understand why on earth they would do that.
I think they thought it was going to be an escalation that would result in the communists and getting more aid from China, and it would escalate the war.
Huh. So you allow the sites that would blow your planes out of the sky to continue to exist and to fire because to have blown them up would constitute an escalation. That just strikes me as nuts.
Well, it is, and they thought it was crazy. And of course, you have to remember the other thing that was happening then was that a lot of the airstrikes and the stuff that was going on during the Johnson administration was being micromanaged from the White House.
Yeah. Does it seem like, and this is definitely outside the scope of your book, but does it seem like we at least have a little bit more of a recognition that that kind of micromanagement is a problem, that we may have at least somewhat learned that lesson from Vietnam?
Well, I don't know. I don't know enough about the ins and outs and the under the mechanics. I've never gotten under the hood of the second Iraq War and Afghanistan. But certainly the first Iraq War was informed, the way it was fought was informed by the lessons of Vietnam, which is you go in strong, you know what victory represents. And Colin Powell was a great believer of this, as was General Schwartz. What was his name? Schwarzkopf. Yeah, they were believers in this. And you went in with a lot of allies. I mean, there we had 40 different countries who were supporting us. Now, we had our allies in Vietnam, but there were small contingents from Australia, the Philippines, South Korea, but nothing like the coalition, the first Gulf War. And I think you saw the lessons of Vietnam at work there.
Yep. So let's segue, sort of a strange change, but given that I'm an animal lover, I have to admit that in the midst of discussing this book with all the human drama, trauma, loss of life, and efforts to save human life, I have to ask you about Ralph the cat. So this is the cat, for those listening, this is the cat with a name tag that read Ralph, property of U.S. Senior Advisor, do not eat. And
that's right.
And you had said in the book that he escaped his cage when he was being evacuated from his owner's house, and and shelling began. Was he ever found?
No, because they never went back.
Oh.
I mean, that was that shelling was, again. This is the man I talked about earlier who led the convoy of his employees out, and when he got out, he realized that not only had he left Ralph behind, but he'd left a couple of crucial people behind who were going to be in danger. So he went back to pick up Ralph and to rescue a couple of these South Vietnamese who had worked for him and would have been on a communist death list for sure. And when he landed, he came under fire and had very little time to do it, and they brought out the Ralph in the cage, and in the excitement, the cat escaped. So no, Walter never find out what happened to Ralph.
I predict if Hollywood has anything to say about the movie version of this book, Ralph will be found at the very end. He'll be running across the runway or something.
Well, that's possible. I haven't seen the screenplay yet, so I'm not sure. I can't answer that.
Okay. Do you think that that your book rehabilitated the reputations of any specific Americans?
I think if it rehabilitated anything, it rehabilitated the kind of not rehabilitated, but it helped the reputation of career civil servants and military in Vietnam, and particularly some of the State Department people. I mean, I gave you a story of two State Department employees who were in Washington, who had spent some time in South Vietnam before, and were worried what was going to happen to their Vietnamese friends and coworkers, people they'd worked for, and they were getting communications, and they were in the State Department because they could see that the end was near, and so they asked permission. The State Department was then refusing to let employees go back to South Vietnam for this purpose, and they asked for permission to take their holiday. They weren't even going to go as State Department employees. They just and they were told no, under no circumstance can you do that. And they just went AWOL anyway. They bought their own air tickets and flew there on the last commercial Pan Am flight to go into Saigon. There was one that came later to evacuate the Pan Am personnel. And they spent 2 or 3 days there. And when they were there, the American ambassador got a cable from the State Department to have them detained and expelled. And then Graham Martin not only tried to do that, and he sent the State Department security officers who were in Saigon looking for them, but he also notified the South Vietnamese police, which would have been very serious if these people, Rosenblatt and Johnston, had been arrested, because they could have been sitting in a South Vietnamese prison when the communists marched into town.
Wow.
Anyway, they wore disguises. They set up a couple of safe houses, and they smuggled people into Tan Son Nhut, into the airport, and got them on flights, onto the evacuation flights. And they spent about 48 hours, maybe a little bit more there, rescued hundreds of people, and then got out themselves at the last minute.
So I talked about whether the book had rehabilitated any specific Americans' reputations. Do you think it damaged or soiled the reputations of any specific Americans? And specifically, I'm wondering about, with Ambassador Martin, I feel like it sort of split the difference. It was some positive, some negative. But what about Henry Kissinger, President Ford, Senator George McGovern?
I think Ford comes out pretty well in the end.
In the end, yes.
Yeah. Ford is the one who, on a couple of occasions, at the end, after the people were in the United States, he insists on, pushes Congress to put through the money for the resettlement camps and everything. But also, he was very much influenced by David Kennerly, who was the official White House photographer who had become very close to Ford and to his family. Kennerly had photographed Ford for the cover of Time a few years before, and really was treated almost as a son. And Kennerly went off to South Vietnam. He had won a Pulitzer Prize for his war photographs of the Vietnam War a few years earlier. So in March of '75, Kennerly joins a fact-finding mission that Ford has sent to South Vietnam, and goes and sees for himself what's happening. And he comes back and tells Ford that the whole thing is over, that the country's going to fall within weeks. And he is very influential with Ford. At one point, the military tries to stop the evacuation planes from going into Tan Son Nhut about a day before. The end comes, and I can't remember, the reasons are in the book, but when he learns this, Kennerly goes into the White House and tells Ford what's going on, and Ford insists that the flights continue.
Yeah.
So I think Ford wanted to do the right thing, and in the end he did. But there were people, particularly he had to fight against Congress.
Yeah.
I mean, if there are any villains in the book, it's largely the congressmen and senators who didn't want to bring a single South Vietnamese into the country.
Yeah,
and they were reflecting the views of the American people at the time.
I know.
Who were sick of Vietnam, sick of Vietnamese, and the last thing they wanted was 130,000 Vietnamese coming to the country at a time when the unemployment was 9% and we were in a recession.
Yeah, I was a little bit bothered by some of the quotes from Senator George McGovern.
Oh, yeah.
I just the belief that there wouldn't be any retribution to speak of against those who helped us so much when they're left in the country. I think that is as unrealistic as the beliefs of Ambassador Martin, that there's no way the North Vietnamese would take Saigon.
Well, there was a certain callousness in the country at the time, and particularly among people who had been part of the anti-war movement, who had painted the South Vietnamese as not worthy of evacuation, not worthy of help. They were kind of tarred with the brush of they were all corrupt, they were all, threw people in jail, they were anti-democratic, they were kind of getting what they deserved, in other words. And so that seeped into the political dialogue as well. And it's why people like McGovern, who run on an anti-war platform, um, wanted. In fact, even after they've come, he advocated sending them back. He thought that 90% should be sent back and that they'd be perfectly all right. Of course, this was at a time when there was a genocide going on by the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. And as it turned out, a lot of the South Vietnamese who were sent to what were called re-education camps, who were really concentration camps, had a horrific death rate, and some were in these camps for as much as 18 years. So, no, you see this, and in the book I talk about the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and people coming and talking about, what kind of money they would allocate for refugee resettlement. And basically, people like Senator Javits and Senator Biden said that they would only pay money to get people out, to get the South Vietnamese out, if it was a way of getting Americans out. But they were afraid that the South Vietnamese government was going to hold Americans hostage unless the South Vietnamese got out as well. And so that was their excuse for, bringing some of the South Vietnamese out. But the real reason for the evacuation flights, as far as they were concerned, were to get these thousands of Americans out. And of course, the Americans, as I mentioned in the book, I mean, we had a situation originally, there were 7,000 Americans, but a lot of them were former military, people who had stayed or come back and were married to Vietnamese women and had families and considered their family to include their wives, in-laws, and cousins and uncles and everything else. And unless all of them could go, their wives weren't going to go and they weren't going to go.
Yeah, I was struck by the numbers of Americans that had very deep connections to Vietnam and the Vietnamese, as well as the large number of sort of outsized characters in this book. Do you think that was a function of the fact that, we were largely withdrawn and these were sort of the more hardcore people connected to the country, or would that have been the case if you had looked at at Americans in, let's say, 1969?
There were more, and there were. What had happened was, you see, we had, when we withdrew the military, some of the military, the former military, they stayed because they were married, and they were people who knew Vietnam and knew Vietnamese and liked the country, signed up to come back from the United States and work as contractors.
And these Air America, CIA helicopter pilots were some outsized characters too.
Yeah, they were civilians. They weren't CIA agents, CIA officers. They weren't. They were employed by Air America, which was controlled and owned by the CIA. But they were there were a number of Americans who'd fallen in love with the country as well, and fallen in love with the women.
So they
didn't want to leave.
Well, perhaps one of the most sort of outsized characters, the one that you would just love to leave it up to Hollywood to figure out, which star would play this person, was Ed Daly, the airline CEO that was flying refugees out and flying supplies in. And just for the listeners, this is a CEO that was so unusual. He chose two beautiful Japanese women to be his bodyguards, and they would walk around with pistols in waist holsters, rather. And then when they were going to make a run with the pilots and the bodyguards and him himself to Da Nang Airport, you'd said he shouted, "Bring out the ham bones," and then one of the bodyguards opens a trunk full of pistols and automatic rifles, and they start distributing to everybody because they might have to shoot their way to the Da Nang Airport.
Much to the horror of his pilots and flight crew, who were then in his hotel suite at the time when this decision was made. But Ed Daly was quite a character. I mean, he started at World Airways, which did a lot of contracting for the U.S. government at the time, and say what you will, I mean, he put his life on the line several times. He could have easily been killed on the flight that he took. he went along on a rescue flight to Da Nang. His planes were being chartered by the American government to bring Americans and Vietnamese out of Da Nang in March into Saigon to evacuate them from the north. And he went up for a rescue mission. He'd been told not to go, that it was too dangerous, and that the communists had taken the airfield. And he said, "Hell, I'm going to go anyway." And he did. And he went up there, and the plane was overwhelmed by refugees. Most of the people got out were South Vietnamese soldiers who were desperate to leave, and a lot of the women and children never made it on board. But he came close to being. He could have easily been killed or taken by the communists. So he was a controversial fellow, but also ran a number of charities and things. I mean, he's a complicated man.
My personal pitch, if you end up being involved in the production, is I think Matthew McConaughey should play him. So you mentioned charities. That's one thing I wanted to kind of talk about in closing here is because it had a personal connection to me. I did an episode of the podcast. It was episode 37 called Lost in the Night, about the loss of a family friend on one of these sort of interdiction planes that it was a C-130 loaded with electronic equipment, and they would fly right up almost to the Chinese border. And the plane was lost, and it took some 20 years before they ever found the remains of the plane and the crew members. But one of the things that struck me is just a couple of days before that mission, they had spent the evening, all the pilots, at an orphanage there, having a Christmas dinner, with the people that ran the orphanage and the kids. And it struck me throughout the book, there are these instances of Americans making connections with orphanages and making connections with the local kids. Did that strike you as well? Did you expect that level of involvement with the children and supporting those charities?
No, I think I think there was this level of sympathy and connection between Americans and South Vietnamese that went on after the American forces left. And we've been involved in the country for a long time. I mean, since in different ways since 1954, since the French left. So I wasn't that surprised. And also, you have a large number of Amerasian children there who were subjects of great sympathy from Americans because they were outcasts in South Vietnam. And likely to also be, if they were outcasts in South Vietnam, in a communist Vietnam, there were constant reminders of the Americans and of the war, and in fact, they did have a very tough time after 1975, after the communists took over.
Wow!
And a lot of the orphans who were on those airlifts in the final weeks of the war were Amerasian children.
What was the total number in the end that we were able to bring out ourselves? And then in addition, the boat people that were picked up.
Well, the boat people came later. I mean, the number that I came up with, or that is semi-official, is that 130,000, more or less 130,000 Vietnamese, and that includes a few hundred or maybe more Cambodians, made it out of Indochina, South Vietnam, and Cambodia from the middle of March of 75 until the end of April of 75. So more or less 130,000 of those. A lot of them got out by, I think it's about 40,000 or 50,000 came out by air, but a huge number did come out by sea. And in fact, of that number, 30,000 came out on South Vietnamese naval vessels that escaped in the final day or 2 days of the war and were escorted by U.S. warships to the Philippines. And a lot of the people on those Navy ships, those 30,000, were the families of the sailors and naval officers and civilian friends of theirs and relatives who they had packed on these ships. And we took them all.
So tell me, you've done an incredible job in delving into bravery with Raoul Wallenberg, now with the Americans in South Vietnam. Do you know what your next project is going to be?
I've been working. I've had a few. I have a few ideas, and frankly, nothing concrete right now. I'm looking into a very unusual take on the Hiroshima attack, and but now we're all under sheltering in place or whatever, as I am. So I've got a kind of leisurely period here in which I can explore and do a lot of research online and come up with something, because there's not much going on in the publishing world right now.
Yeah, I understand. Well, I will say this. I wish you the best of luck with Honorable Exit. As I've said, it's a fantastic book, and with all your future projects, it's been a pleasure and an honor to speak with you.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed this. I always love to talk to someone who's read the book so well and so with such insight and care. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a great rest of the week.
Okay, bye now.
All right, bye now. I thoroughly enjoyed that interview. It was an honor to talk at length with a great writer and the author of a great book. Political Spirits will be back next week with another entertaining and informative episode. I hope you'll join us. Be sure to listen and tell your friends about Political Spirits, and like the podcast on Facebook at Political Spirits, and follow me and the podcast on Twitter at Franklin Rye. And remember, all episodes are now on YouTube as well, and the YouTube channel is named Political Spirits Network. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell, and select all after you hit the bell. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.